My name is Mark Tallman, and I've worked with the Kansas Association of School Boards on education issues as a lobbyist, researcher, and writer since 1990. I'm conducting this interview with Christy Levings on behalf of the Kansas Oral History Project, a not-for-profit corporation created for the purpose of interviewing former legislators and significant leaders in state government, particularly those who served during the 1960s through 2010. The interviews will be accessible to researchers, educators, and the public through the KOHP website, ksoralhistory.org, and also the Kansas Historical Society and the State Library. Transcriptions are made possible by generous donors, and Dave Heineman is the videographer today. Today, we are shifting our focus to the voice of the teachers in our educational project. I've known Christy Levings for many years, back to when we were both advocates in the legislature in her role leading the Kansas National Education Association, the largest organization of teachers in the state. Christy, pleasure to be with you.
Thank you.
We want to talk about your career, but through that, what you've seen about what's really happened to education over the past several decades. Probably neither of us want to stress how many decades it's gone back, but there has been a lot of change. So why don't we begin as we usually do? Just a little bit about yourself, kind of where you were born, grew up, and then move into what got you interested in a career in education.
Well, I'm a Kansan for my total life. I was born and grew up in Topeka, and except for a couple of stints for different things, I was an exchange student, lived in the Netherlands.
Okay.
Gave me a perspective of looking at the United States from outside in, which was a really remarkable experience. Came back, got ready to go to college after that, and really thought I wanted to go to law school. And I got a part-time job when I started Washburn University in Topeka, tutoring fourth graders at Gage Elementary in Topeka, which was my former elementary school. And I ended up working with a group of fourth grade boys who were having trouble in math. And I worked with them after school and worked on where I saw they had deficits and did that kind of thing. And then I'd been there 2 or 3 weeks when I got called in. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm in trouble now and they're going to let me go. And I kind of need this part-time job while I'm going to school. And the principal said to me, we have a problem. I said, okay, if it's something I'm doing, I'm sure I can fix it. And he said, no, here's the deal. You're doing too good a job. We now have boys who are refusing to do their math during the day because they want to get kicked up into your group after school. Because you're making a game of it. They say that you make it sound fun and interesting. And he said, I want to know why you're not an education student. You need to go. And my former 6th grade teacher came and did the same press. You need to move over and become an educator. You have a knack for that. That makes sense to you. You need to do it. So I did. Graduated at an interesting time in '74. When I left, I not only had certification for K through 8, but I had certification on how to teach in a one-room schoolhouse because that was still a need in Kansas at the time. Not particularly in eastern Kansas where I was, but it was still a need.
Yeah.
So I had an interesting prep compared to today. But one of the things that was a big deal at Washburn was that there was a continuous need for learning all the time. So not only being educators, but being scholars. And I think I left there with that. So I ended up teaching and taught really everything K through 6 over the next 20-some years. And during that time, I really became committed about what teachers needed to do to learn to be better teachers. That was important to me. It was recognizing it, and also recognizing that teaching elementary school is not a volunteer project. It is a professional job, and you need to be prepared for it. I did my first master's program in developmental psychology, and the development of kids as they went through them was a real big piece of that. And while that wasn't directly related to the classroom, it was related to understanding about students and how they learned. My second master's at KU was educational policy administration, because along the way it also began to realize that teachers needed a voice. Teachers needed to be the one talking about what teachers needed, what it took to be a good teacher, what it took to be a piece of that. And I carried that into me as I became involved in the Kansas National Education Association. I carried with me the whole piece about what education is about, which is solving problems and helping individuals learn to be better. That became important to me as an association leader as well too. I also thought that there were processes developed by the legislature. Some worked well, some didn't. But collective bargaining. I, over the years, bargained 16 contracts and brought 2 districts, one a small one, Lewisburg, and one a large one, Olathe, into their first written contracts. But taking with it the whole recognition that it is a problem-solving mechanism that puts the best and demands the best out of the professionals and demands from the district that they support the professionals that they had. So that was kind of the path that got me into the life that I led.
Lot to talk about there. I think what I want to come back to several things, but maybe just I'm interested. That sounds to me like a somewhat different way of deciding I want to be a teacher. I sometimes tell the story when my daughter was in kindergarten. She told us one day, her mother and I, that she thought she might want to be a teacher when she grew up. And I said, oh, like your mother. And she said, no, like Miss Burton, who was her kindergarten teacher. I don't know if she knew her mother was a teacher. She didn't know her in that role. But I guess I'm sort of under the impression that a lot of teachers have it's been a long standing. And maybe that's not true. Yours is a different path. You've obviously worked with a lot of teachers. What can we generalize maybe about the kinds of things that make people decide they want to go into teaching? And I think that's important now because one of our challenges, fewer people are deciding to go into teaching to staff the needs we have. So can you tell me a little bit of your thoughts on that?
I think people go into teaching because they want to help people. And they want to move people from here to here. They want to get that student ready for the next one. You can't be a successful 4th grader if you weren't a successful 3rd grader. And that sort of begins in kindergarten. And the people who take that job want to move them. And of course, I have great admiration from kindergartner teachers because they get this whole mishmash of kids. You'll get kids in a kindergarten class who already read, and others who've maybe never even learned their colors and their shapes, and somehow they're supposed to move that whole group up to the next row. These people want to solve problems to make it better for students. They want to make kids smart and successful down the road. I mean, it's always about down the road. I think one of the smartest things some districts have done is that they have their seniors, high school seniors, walk through a corridor of teachers, starting with the kindergarten teachers, because they're the people who got them on the road to be successful there. That's what teaching is really about. If you ask teachers today what took you out of teaching, or what makes you think I'm tired of this job, is not that. It's nobody supported me, I'm tired of fighting for the materials I need, I'm tired of fighting for the time to do the job. Because teaching as we've institutionalized it is very, very difficult. I mean, it's a job that takes 12 to 13 hours a day, and first of all, you're only going to get paid for 8. But we expect you to do all that other to be ready for tomorrow. Because if you don't do the planning and the grading and keep on top of that and looking ahead where you want to go, if you don't do that, then you are not ready for tomorrow. Right. And it's such a demanding job. And we moved where society doesn't recognize the demand of that. We haven't, in some instances, put leaders in buildings who were educated and well prepared to be that. One of the things that happened during my career, as you talk about this time span, in my career we went from understanding the role of a building administrator from a business type manager, I'm in charge of making sure there's toilet paper in the building, to being a educational leader that's trying to develop professionally every individual in the building so they in turn can develop the students to the best of their ability, who runs ahead of things and takes problems out of the way. And yet I saw the crossover of that. And I felt bad for some of them because they were barely being building managers. They were not prepared to be what was being demanded of them. And as we got into more, some good, some bad, but more types of accountability, that became very apparent and very hard. Turning around, going to the central office and being yelled at because your building's not producing the way we want it to, like it was, not the same as how many widgets can you put together in your factory today, but yell at them because they're not doing, so they go back to the schoolroom and yell at the teachers, you're not producing what we want today. It's not a system that works. So we've seen that change. We saw a different group of people go into administration, and the teachers that are coming in have very different ideas. They know they're not there to prepare widgets, and they're not going to be treated that way. But we've seen a huge mega shift in that.
And what are, in your opinion, looking back on this, what are some of the key things that led that change, right? So if we go back over that roughly 50-year period, so we go back to the 70s, I mean, probably a good point. I think the one thing my reading of history tells me is we've always thought we have an education crisis, right? I mean,
Right.
about any time you look at our schools are failing, we've got to get better. Now, there's also a lot of support for schools. I mean, it goes a lot of different ways, but there is chronically this feeling that, well, maybe it is simply we have to get better. What are some of the things that you think, maybe starting with what you think of has been helpful, has led to, I don't know, should we say higher expectation? You talk about a lot of things, different role of the teacher, different role of leadership, maybe different expectations on students. What are some of the things that you think has motivated those changes?
Well, I think one of the things that blessed the state for a period of time were the leaders in the various education organizations, as well as the Department of Ed. I mean, the amazing job Andy Tompkins did leading the Department of Ed, as well as leaders, and the ability to collaborate, work together. The Kansas Learning First Alliance, which was put together from leadership from the Kansas Association School Board, the superintendent's group, the principals group, Kansas NEA, the individuals who came in that room and talked about we could work together and make things better, and we could learn a lot about where it was. When I talked to other people in other states about that, they told me we couldn't even get those same people in the same room together, let alone working together. I think we were blessed by leadership at the time that was willing to do something better. And we were willing to look at what accountability was. Because I spent time as a national officer of the NEA and in 6 years worked in 42 different states, I saw the perspective of what Kansas was doing. And we didn't take enough credit for some of the great stuff that we were doing. I mean, we had accountability on a lot of issues that was working very well for us. There were other states that couldn't say that. I mean, when No Child Left Behind was brought into effect in the Bush administration, in some states it pulled aside and really showed an ugly interior. I mean, some states said, we know that the education on our reservation schools is really, really bad, so we just don't count that. And when they had to, it was devastating. Kansas had never played some of those games, I think partly due to the legislation and legislative and education leaders in the state. We'd never played that game. And we had some, I was at the state board meeting when the ACT people came and said, okay, we don't know what you're doing. What are you doing? Are you sure you're doing this fairly and correctly? Because you're scoring a point or more above the national average and nobody does that. Well, we like to think that we had developed, first of all, our own standards long before anybody asked us to, our ongoing development of our teachers. I was president of Kansas NEA at the 50th anniversary of Brown v. Board. And so I got a lot of requests for an interview as a teacher leader during that time. I'm not sure it was all flattering because one young reporter for Education Week wanted to know what I felt like when the Brown v. Board decision came down. And I had to point out to her I was about 11 months old. So I didn't have a lot of feelings about that, but she obviously thought I was much better. And she wanted to know if I could find some teachers who were actually working when the decision came down, and I said, I certainly hope not, because I hope our people are not on the job at 86 years old. But she did ask me questions about it, and I'd been licensed in the state since 1974, you know, and I had both a teacher and administrative license for 50 years in the state. But anyway, during that time, she said to me, when did you start doing professional development, where you had to renew your license with new learning? And I said, well, I've had a license since 74, and we always have. I always have done that. And she said, well, that's not true. I said, yes, ma'am, that is in fact true. You can call the Department of Ed if you want to ask them when it started, because I can't tell you that. I just know that and all that. She said, but that's much farther than any state in the union. We know that at Education Week. I said, well, then you should know that we've been doing that this long. And continuous learning has always been a part of what we're about. But I do think it's the crossroads of the leadership in KSAB and Kansas KNEA who are willing to say there's something more important than our individual agendas, and that's the agenda today for the state.
And you know, you alluded to some things where, at least in my experience, and we've shared some of this, organizations, leaders do try to work together. There have been challenges throughout that period. So
Sure
let's
have.
go back a little further again, maybe zeroing in a little bit of the 1970s. A couple things come to mind, maybe ask you to respond to. Maybe not because you probably weren't directly involved at the beginning of them, but maybe how they've changed over time. So one thing that we associate with the 70s is the passage of the federal special education law,
Right.
states coming into compliance with that. That's something in some of these, I always in these sessions want to sort of help people understand from a historical viewpoint what's different. And of course, a major thing was shifting from there's kids we just really aren't even going to try to help to saying we want to try to help every child no matter what. How have you seen that being implemented, or what are some of the ramifications, maybe good, maybe bad, maybe new challenges as a result of that? Because you'd have been in the profession just when that was really getting started, I understand.
Yeah, 94,142 was a number we all could say, and what it meant. You know, when I grew up in Topeka and walked to Gage School, we used to walk past Donnie every day because Donnie sat on his front steps. Donnie was Down syndrome, and he waved at us, and we waved back at him every morning and every noon. But Donnie didn't go to school. So now I'm grown up, and we have 94,142, and Donnie's going to go to school. And it was a scramble for some schools. It was a place of how do we find the answer for what we need to do. Unfortunately, we got 94,142. We got very little money to make it happen. So a lot of people were scrambling and taking money out of school districts' funds that really stretched them, that should have gone to other things that now had to go to special ed. But I saw that, and I saw what we learned to work together. Learned words like IEP to develop an individual plan for each of those children and what it was. And I saw things that happened where parents literally showed up with attorneys to say, yes, we too know what 94,142 means, and it means our child's going to go to school, and what are you going to do for it? We had a lot of things we had to figure out. I remember having a conversation with a set of parents who had a very disabled child. And I wanted the best for that child, but they wanted that child to have water therapy in a pool every day. And I said, we don't have a pool. And she said, well, I want the district to build a pool. And I said, I understand that, but I'm thinking we're looking for a different solution, because I'm thinking the district's not building a pool here. And there'd be a lot more costs besides building the pool. I mean, getting the staff to do it. I mean, I can't leave the classroom and go out to the pool with your child. Right. So there was a lot to figure out, right, and a lot to work through. And some we were good at and some we were not good at. And there were some that it really pushed them. I mean, I remember talking with some administrators who really were at the end of their rope. They didn't know what to do.
And I think that gets into a question that we've, I'm sure, both dealt with, talking with the public, talking to legislators. It's an ongoing question about costs, and why do costs keep going up? Why do demands keep going up? And You know, the general theory of inflation is how much more does it cost this year to buy a loaf of bread than last year or 10 years ago or 50 years ago? But you're usually still talking about a loaf of bread. We can define that.
Right.
But what we now expect from education, 50 years ago, we weren't trying to educate kids who wanted and maybe needed water therapy or needed one-on-one.
Right.
And I think one of the issues that comes back is, one fact of life is that schools have significantly increased the number of employees, but a big portion of that has been to meet those special need kids that we weren't before and whose parents, exercising their rights, continue to want more services, but those either are going to have to come at the expense of others, or we have to find ways to add that. There's been a lot of tension around that.
There has been a lot of tension around that. There's also been a lot of tension about the regular classroom teacher. Because I think in the beginning people thought that that was just another thing the regular classroom teacher could do.
Right.
I mean, honestly, I had a couple of kids in class, well, I have 25 other kids, who really needed a lot of individualized help. And I'm thinking, one of these days I'm going to get sued because these 25 are not getting what they need, because I'm doing a lot of keeping them busy activities so that I can try to move these two as much as I can. I had a child who I honestly think it's the closest I ever came to having a mother slap me, but I thought she had her fist up in my face because she was refusing special services for a child who desperately needed them, and she wants me to fail him. And I said, I'm not failing your child. I am teaching your child at the level he is. And when I tested him in reading, he was about 1.6, and now this is a fourth grade class, and I moved him to 2.8 by the end of the year. I was pretty damn proud of that. That was more than a year's growth for a child who desperately had to have one-on-one services. And she's furious because she wants him given fourth grade material and marked as a fail, because that will motivate him to do what he has to do. It isn't. I mean, and the district had tested her, showed her the results. He had severe learning disabilities and some physical disabilities. She took him to an independent and paid to have an independent evaluation, who told her exactly the same thing. And she still wants, and I said, I'm not doing it. I am not going to mark this child psychologically as a failure when he's really working his tush off to the best of his ability. And then I told the superintendent that I really preferred not to meet with her alone anymore. It was a struggle of a period of time. Yeah. And, it's still, your loaf of bread thing is a really interesting thing, because we now want to give a loaf of bread, and, plain loaf of bread costs $2, but we want to get back is an artisan French loaf made of exotic grains.
Yeah.
But we want to pay $2 for it.
Right. And I guess that's the thing that, now that I can look back over 50 years plus, at this point, maybe we can look back and see that change. Most people, most parents, they're looking at a much shorter, they're looking where we are now, right?
Yeah.
What does my kid need today? What do I want today? What do I want to pay in taxes today? Not necessarily reflecting the differences of what we are asking for as a system. So you mentioned moving a little away from special ed to maybe the regular classroom a little broader. I think you also talked about No Child Left Behind. That, I guess, is another thing I'd maybe ask you to reflect on, is just even beyond special education, changes in what we expect theoretically every student or every non-disabled student to be able to achieve. What's your perspective on how those general standards or expectations of the system as a whole has changed?
Well, I would say the big overall thing for me is it isn't bad at all to think that we want the best for every single kid. What the problem is when you think you're going to get that by doing the same things you've always done. I don't know, you may remember I had quite a dialogue with a former chair of the House Education Committee and saying to him that I might be a Kansas farm wife, but I know that cows don't gain weight by just weighing them over and over again. It makes a difference what you feed them and how much you put into them and what kind of grain you get and what, and then you're going to get a weight gain. So just thinking let's test them every semester, every quarter is not going to give you different results if you're not doing the other thing. And that was really the piece of it. And the conversation from the national level was not a bad conversation. For one thing, we had no accountability across the country. I mean, we had such a kerfuffle over trying to put national standards in place. But I can tell you that having been in all the states, it's a very unique opportunity I had to be in education system in so many states because there was such difference. In Louisiana, the first grade standards were to count to 25. In Massachusetts, the first grade standards were to be able to count over 100, to be able to add and subtract, which were not even included in these standards. I mean, the difference between states, so to be able to say, let's have every kid count to 100, would have brought up some states and that needed to have somebody shove them a little bit. And like I say, the variation as we attended national meetings with the Federal Department of Ed under No Child Left Behind, they had no idea of what states recorded and didn't record. Arkansas, for instance, had a state law, which I'm sure went way back to post-Civil War. They could only record people in population as white or black. They could not be recorded as Native American or Asian American or anything else. You had to be white or black. So they had no test data except white or black because nobody could be recorded any other way. And the Department of Ed is saying to the Arkansas Department of Ed, you need to change that and do it this way. And they're saying, sir, I have no ability to change state law. I can't do that. The legislature will have to do it. And I don't think they're very likely to do that. And so it simply was an opportunity under No Child Left Behind. I mean, there were things we learned, and I know people hated it because some places just interpreted it as more testing. And again, you get back to gaining weight. It doesn't matter how many times you weigh. But so there was that. But like I say, I was really shocked at looking at when North Dakota and South Dakota were forced to open up and look at their graduation rates and their achievement rates in their reservation schools. It was appalling. And they weren't the only ones. The southern states pulled them apart. I got off the plane every time I came home to Kansas and said, thank you, God. Because we did not know the jewel that we had, and we didn't appreciate the system that we had. Like I say, to have ACT show up and say, so why are you doing so much better? But I worry we've not kept up with that over time and that we haven't shepherded that the way it should.
And as we are recording this in 2025, as someone who's looked at this a long time, I share some of those concerns. There are some measures that suggest, while Kansas still, by most metrics, is an above average state, some kinds of very good, I think there are some areas where at least we raise some concerns about how we compete with other states, what they're doing, and maybe how well they've taken up the call to widen that. As in some of these interviews that viewers can look at, one of the things that has really struck me, again, as someone who's spent much of my career debating test scores and their relevance, is and frustration that they aren't improving fast enough, is to also remember that the most recent data I've been able to find, Kansas and the nation last year, the last recorded year, had the highest graduation rate on record, and every level of credential from high school graduation to technical certificate to bachelor's, master's has hit a record high as more and more students complete high school and are successful enough with whatever challenges to even go on beyond that as we call for that. That's, I guess, some measure that despite the day-to-day problems and debate and those gaps that still exist, broadly speaking, some good things have worked. You've talked about some things that may be part of that. Special education for disabled students, No Child Left Behind, to make sure you're other groups that we made to look at. You've talked about the need, you can't just keep doing the same thing. You've also mentioned professional development. So talk a little bit about, as you said, that isn't really a new concept, but maybe how has it changed, or how has that helped teachers do a different and hopefully better job?
Well, when I began, that constant learning process had to be college hours. And just taking a college class doesn't hurt you, and it makes you hopefully continue to see yourself as a scholar, but it really didn't direct into the work. So the changes to the professional development in the state was a part that was really big, and it was the professional development plan that was adopted by the Department of Ed, and our organizations work hard. Kansas KNEA worked hard. The Kansas Learning First Alliance worked very hard on, was to recognize that quality professional development was aimed at making you better with the skills you needed in the classroom, to widen your knowledge about the content area if you're a secondary teacher. How do we get that, and look for different ways? And looking at it on site and recording it in school districts and providing it, and looking at the quality of what professional development happened at the school district level. And that stepped on some toes. What do you mean we don't have good professional development here? Well, does anybody leave with any new skills? Well, I thought it was just we got together, we had a speaker. I'll never forget, I was at a secondary school, and the principal said to me, "I just have to tell you, I don't want anybody to know, but our professional development, we have to keep it a secret." And I'm thinking, oh my Lord, what are we talking about? He said, "We didn't have a speaker. What we did was we found a book about teaching reading skills at the secondary level that we were really impressed with, and we worked our way together as a group, chapter by chapter. We all left with ways to implement new reading skills at the secondary level across the building. But I know that's not really professional development because we didn't have a speaker." Right. And I said, "No, really? You had the best kind of professional development. You don't need a speaker." You might think about what you want the next time they'll take you farther, and that might take a specialist to come in and be your speaker. But this is really what professional development is about, is being better. It is about how do you get the skills you can implement of where it is, and how are you open to skills like coaching. In my school district of Latham, one of the jobs I had there prior to my officer level at NEA is I worked with professional development for other educators. And I also coached new teachers and worked on developing that. I worked on professional development for administrators on how to bring professionals along and bring them into the piece, which is an interesting piece, because if you look at the exit surveys from people leaving the profession, it's always, my administrator did not know how to support me to do my job. It's a huge piece of why they left. And so trying to develop professional development for all of them. And there were people here who recognized if we were moving forward, there were things we had to know and be able to do.
Yeah, if our viewers can't tell, we're sitting in the one-room schoolhouse on the campus of Emporia State, and that just reminds me that I've done interviews and work with the individuals who do a kind of a teacher working condition survey every few years.
Right.
And one of the things that probably no big reveal to you, but they always bring out is, what seems to make such a difference is the role of the principal or the building leader in helping their teachers feel heard and valued. And I don't know whether statistically everyone has talked about, are they happier because they're paid more? Well, most people would be. But regardless, it seems, of the level of salary, part of that sense of working condition is, how do you perceive you are treated and listened to, led in a positive way? And I think that there's been a big movement in Kansas, we've talked a little about this, to improve that as well. I'm gathering those are things that I hope you've seen, I guess I've heard over your time. Is that more of just kind of, and it's almost an internal, we know we want to get better and we're figuring out that's part of it, or are there's some other factors involved?
Well, it's never going to be stationary. There's always going to be change. There's always going to be more things to learn. And I think, honestly, that was a frame of mind that some people had to learn. You know, it's like, why do we have to keep on learning? Because nothing stays the same. I mean, and there are pieces of it that, you know, when I started teaching, the length of the elementary day is virtually the same. The amount of curriculum that you need to put into that child in the same type of day is 200 or 300% greater than what it was. But it was the same day.
Yeah.
And I noticed the other day that we have another big thing coming about reinstating more recess time. And I don't think there are many teachers who would say kids don't need recess. They're just trying to figure out how to do all the other. You know, when I started teaching, I wasn't figuring out when they were going to take keyboarding.
Yeah.
And we're doing computer with every kid to the kindergarten level now. You know, where are they? And what are our expectations when they can leave? And the interesting thing that still happens is we have a mindset about that loaf of bread, you know, that costs $2, is I watched a small community near me talk about replacing their public library. And somebody wrote in and said, I don't understand why building school buildings and building a public library is so expensive. My dad was on the library board in 1968 and they paid $90,000 to build the library. And I don't understand why it's going to cost this many millions now. And if you look at what, should a high school have a functioning library, it can cost $10 million to outfit a public high school with the kind of computer and resource material that they need to prepare those students to go into jobs. I would tell you, my district had a real benefit in that Garmin International sits in the middle of it. And all you got to do is have Garmin people come over and say, here's what we expect from your high school graduates. And they're like, oh, okay, so we really do have upgrading we have to do if you expect this out of our graduates. But I also saw that, had an opportunity, the commander, and I'm not going to say his rank because I know whether he was a lieutenant general or whatever he was, but he is the commander of a huge aircraft carrier. And he did an interview about the fact that of the 2,000 people that are on that ship and make it operate, and that it's totally computer driven, that 50% or more of them were in high school 2 years earlier. And they had come directly in there to train, and what his expectations of those high school students was in order to do that, to provide the national defense for this nation. I mean, our schools play this huge role, and teachers play this huge role, and they feel that responsibility, but what drives them out is what you said. It's not the resources that are there or the support that's there. It isn't salary. I've never seen a study about teachers and their beliefs where salary is number one. It's usually third or fourth. And there's such a disparity. I mean, I saw figures just last week. The average salary for a 15 to 20 year person in Kansas is about $60,000. In New Jersey, it's a little over $95,000. There's huge disparity across the country. We never believed Kansas would be the first in salary, but we were at the middle, and we're not any longer in the middle. We're down in the low 40s. You know, and those things don't help us. But if you're still believing that you can build a public library for $90,000, you're not really got a good feel for what it takes to run a quality education system.
So, discussing salary and some of the things a little bit, let's talk about another development from the 70s when you were just starting. And, you know, in my own mind, you know, I kind of try to think of some of the big things that sort of happened decade by decade. The 70s, I was just kind of moving through high school and college. So I don't have as much a memory, perhaps, as some.
That's really sad.
I know, but one of the things that clearly was a national movement, and in Kansas, you mentioned getting collective bargaining.
Right.
If you want to put it in the general term of teacher rights. So, you know, you again, through your career, both as a teacher and then moving into leadership of organizations, had a chance to observe the impact of bringing collective bargaining, due process procedures, some of those things into our system, certainly controversial at the time. And when I went to work for the School Board Association in the 1990s, we weren't all that far away from some of those issues and some of the frustrations of local school boards who, well, necessarily didn't maybe want to share some of that authority, probably human nature, but we now had a state law that made some of those things had to happen. People had to get used to that. That's something else we can look back on now. Over time, what is your sense on how that has worked, or has it worked well? Where are there still problems? Have you seen attitudes changed? Because you've worked with a lot of associations working with local boards. What are your perspectives on that?
Well, it's certainly come a long way. And you're absolutely right. In the beginning, it worked well some places, and some places it worked really badly. It also depended on what people's understanding of collective bargaining was, and there wasn't always good advice about that. Southeast Kansas, who had a lot of union experience from the miners and whatnot, they handled it so badly there. And I might say got some really bad advice from KASB.
Before I went to work there,
Before you went to work there, yes, before you went to work there, really bad advice. And some people tested the law and got really bad advice. Seaman is another place that got really bad advice, laid off, fired all their teachers, and started again, lost huge institutional history. And I had several school board members from Seaman over the years say to me, that was the stupidest thing we ever did. The stupidest thing we ever did. Collective bargaining is supposed to be a problem-solving process, and it was not seen at that in the beginning. I've always believed that. It is. You're right. There are districts, both administrators, superintendents, and school boards who did not want to share, didn't want to see it as that, and it was hard to push it to where it was. And it was hard to get everybody on board that this is a problem-solving thing. And that you use the process. And people penalized people. I had a school board member in Lewisburg who, fortunately for me, well, he tried to get me fired in a public meeting, and it was because he was angry over bargaining. Fortunately for me, he'd gone to a party the week before, and after a few drinks had told everybody at the party he was going to do that. So I had all these witnesses step forward and say, wait a minute. So he ended up publishing a public apology in the local newspaper, which I enjoyed immensely. And so there were some bad examples along the way. But recognizing that it is about making things better. And Olathe, which I spent a number of years with that organization and brought 10 contracts together there. They went in it looking at what some other people were going and saying, we're not doing that. That's not for us. And making it, melding it, pushing it into a problem-solving process. It's still pinched a little occasionally about what it was. But I had worked with another spectacular leader, Dr. Ron Wimmer, and we believed collectively what we were about was making the district better and was solving problems. He ended up getting a lot of grief from some of his administrators saying, why are you working with her so well? He goes, because she's telling me stuff you're not, and she's finding problems in the district and helping me get them situated, so we're operating better all the time. And when you have a huge district like Olathe, Shawnee Mission, Blue Valley, Wichita, it has to be about how do you make it better. And some people have a bad history. I remember having a conversation with the president of NEA Topeka and the superintendent. I took them to lunch and I said, now here's the deal. You two can keep carrying these suitcases of your bad history and hateful behavior, or you can drop these suitcases and decide you want to go on and do something different. It's really up to you two. And to their real credit, they said, we can do better. And they brought all their teacher leaders and their administrators together, and we collectively did training for them, and they got better. Not perfect, but they got better than they'd ever been before. I'm not going to say that the road we've been on is easy or that it's solved, but it is. And, challenges against due process that have gone on in the last 10 years are stupid. And they don't help anybody, but I guess they make somebody feel better about it. I don't know. And there are legislators who are still angry that the court case that brought school finance forward One of them was complaining about it just in March at a legislative breakfast. She didn't know I was there, I don't think. Anyway, she began to talk about how the Supreme Court, and calling them, remember they called them the old ladies in petticoats, had forced them to do this school finance thing. And I finally had enough, and I stood up and said, Karen, you know better than that. That's not true. And here's why you had to, because you didn't fulfill your half of the bargain. You didn't do your legislative work, and you're still trying not to do your legislative work. And that really doesn't cut it anymore. People expect it. But we have a group of parents that don't have some of that history, and they don't understand it. I don't think they know. They're going to have to speak up, and they're going to have to talk for their schools, because not everybody has their best interest in mind. The push to change to elected Supreme Court is in some people's minds about the fact that the courts forced the legislature to do the right thing for the schools. And that would be a huge mistake all the way around. And there are people who don't have that history, and they need to be aware of it.
Well, and I guess it is worth knowing that there have been school finance cases and plaintiffs being successful in many different states with many different types of methods of selecting the court. So to some extent, the question is it due to who's on the court, or is it due to what is the state of law, and what are you arguing, what are you trying to do, and those kinds of things. Like you, I've observed probably three major battles over, probably the three real legislative battles over school finance, and one of the issues that always comes back is this, school funding is about providing the resources necessary to do what? And if you continue to want more, then that becomes the question of, well, what are the resources necessary to get more? It's pretty obvious we can get the results we have now for what we're spending, because we are. But most people, on whatever side of the aisle you are, continue to want more. May not always want the same things. Often they do, sometimes they don't. But in most cases, it's rarely saying, everything's fine, we don't need to get any better. And that seems to be a theme of what you're talking about during all of this. So, you've mentioned several things. I just want to see if there's anything else you want to say about any particular reason that kind of led you into your involvement with NEA locally, and then your experience as the state leader. And you've already talked again a little bit about some of your national work, but just over that period of time, was there any particular developments or things you're proud of, or maybe regrets or disappointments over that period of time from the viewpoint of the organizations?
Well, I think one of the things I'm most proud of is bringing forward the role that if you're going to talk about what's good for the classroom, you have to talk about what's good for the teacher. Not only just to make things better for the teacher, but to make things better for education. You can't only talk about one side of it without talking about what improves for the teacher and the administration. And the teacher has to have a voice in that. And I guess that's what really got me involved, is we have to have a voice. I remember early on talking about school calendar with my superintendent, and him saying, well, what difference does it make? And I'm saying, well, it makes a really big difference. If you take the break here, it's hard for the high school teachers to get in what they need to get in each semester. If you run too straight through here, it's too hard on the elementary kids because they get too tired and they can't function. And he's like, oh, well, I only thought we just had to figure out how many days we had to have. Well, no, there really is a lot that has to go into putting this calendar together. And that comes from the teacher voice and being a piece of it. Schools are very complicated environments, and they run it. And people outside of it don't always recognize. I remember a legislator who wanted to tour a building in Olathe, so I said, well, meet me there. We'll meet in the front hall. So we came in the front hall, and she had a reporter with her. I said, fine, let's just do it. And I said, we're going to start a tour here. Let's stand here for just a moment. I want you to listen. And they stood there for a minute, and they're like, well, we don't hear anything. I said, exactly. There are 650 children in this building today. You don't hear anything because a group of professionals has them involved in appropriate activities, so you're not hearing screaming, yelling, fighting, whatever. because professionals know how to do that, and they had to do it. And recognizing that it's a very complicated thing, and the teacher voice has to be a piece of it. And that there had to be somebody, while teachers are in the classroom doing their thing, that was out here talking about what they needed. And I guess that's the thing I'm most proud of, is constantly being out there talking about, here's what teachers need, here's what's realistic. I had a legislator tell me, I don't know why we need school breakfast. When I was growing up, my teacher kept a box of crackers in the drawer, and kids could go get a cracker if they needed one. And I said, well, this year there are 32,000 children enrolled in Olathe district schools. I'm not sure a box of crackers is going to do it. So all of us have experience as a student. We sometimes think that transfers. I know how schools operate, because really you don't know nothing that what's going on back here. You know your little piece of it out here. And parents and the public sometimes carry those. And like we talked about earlier, it's a time thing. What did it cost to do it in 1955? And then we get the reverse, going back to the good old days. And so somebody needs to talk about what they were. The level of education to draftees in the Second World War was so alarming that the National Education Association, the National School Board Association, the National PTA moved a huge effort, and that's where the celebration of American Education Week in November comes from, to put an emphasis on education, because there were so many illiterate people who came into the drafted into the military. They couldn't get them to read instructions because they couldn't read. The graduation rate in 1948, 1950 was like 40%. So people do a lot of good old days that has no good old days. And there has to be somebody who's constantly talking about where we've come, what we do, and what we need today. The pandemic was an absolutely earth-shattering thing. Had we ever done it before? Well, actually we have. People say, we've never closed our schools, we've done that. It's not really true. There were 2 instances in the 50s where schools were closed in some states for 2 years because of polio. And there's some great pictures that shows kids on the ground at home. They're on the floor and they're listening to the radio because they're broadcasting lessons out for them during that time. A lot of kids didn't have any structure to get them through the pandemic, and we really are building back of that. And it was a change, and we had to recognize a change. My grandson was a 4th grader. He finished 4th grade with me and then did 5th grade the next year with me. Went back to school doing better. Well, if you get a one-on-one with the teacher, but there were a lot of kids who didn't come back that. And it didn't only affect their educational level, it affected a lot of things. My youngest granddaughter was a senior, and 3 years ago. Anyway, I was trying to talk to her about applications for scholarships and things, and she said, Grandma, you need to stop and think. I'm a pandemic kid, and I can't tell you what clubs and organizations I went to. I can't tell you about the volunteer stuff I've done the last 2 or 3 years, because it didn't exist for me. I'm very different from what it was. I thought that was very astute from a 17-year-old to say, this is how it has affected me. Teachers need a voice out there all the time, and I want to do that. And they don't get enough credit for how hard they work. And like I say, the reality is, somebody said to me, I don't understand why you're always talking about improving teacher salaries. I said, well, because they work 8 hours a day, they get paid for 8, they work 12, and I always get this thing is that they get all this paid holiday. You do realize they don't get paid for any of that. They don't even get paid for Christmas Day. What job do you know of a professional person doesn't have a paid holiday for Christmas Day? They don't, and they still don't. And still, I talk to people all the time who say, you mean they're not paid in the summertime? No, they are not paid in the summertime. That still exists, and we still haven't addressed that, of how we can do the recognition of what the profession needs. But I think I nudged it, pushed it, kicked it a little over time, and that's what I'm most proud about.
So what have you been doing? I don't know if I should say you're retired. What have you been doing after your active time leading, with KNEA, some of those other things? I know you've got a lot of other things that you're involved with. Tell me about some of those.
Well, one of the things that I did actively when I was working was work with boards and I've done training for lots of nonprofits, even a school board, and leadership teams. I work with leadership teams in organizations that have a governance leader and a staff leader. The training for that and the development of partnership of that, I'm still doing a little of that, but I've done a lot of it over the last few years. That's a partnership that is immense, and there's really good work and research out there for it. And like I say, I've worked with a number of nonprofits that were not education stuff, but I do that. And some for-profit, actually. I've done a couple of for-profit organizations. I do a lot of volunteer work. I have a real passion about hunger, so I do fundraising for food for a homeless shelter, development of meals for a homeless shelter in Kansas City, Kansas. You know, do good works about that, and how do we support families and that piece of it.
Sounds like definitely keeping busy.
I try to. I
think we've covered the main topics I wanted to go over. Before we wrap up, let me give you one more chance. If you think of something that I missed that you want to mention or talk about, or just any kind of concluding thoughts, now would be the time.
Well, one story I haven't told that's really important to me. In my national role, I had the opportunity to work with the U.S. Secretary, Arne Duncan. I used to say, I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing that Arne knows my name, but he would always stop and talk to me. And he really, for a guy who got stuck with a lot of bad press, he was a very kind man. My first round of breast cancer happened when I was doing that work, and Arne checked on me, made sure I was coming through that okay. So great guy. But his experience had been in Chicago. And he and President Obama tended to equate public schools with what they had worked with in there. And I would say to them on a regular basis, if you will please, let me bring the president, let me bring you, Secretary, to Olathe, America, to any of the Kansas public schools. I want you to see how they function and what we're doing for kids and the way we have raised the standards and are looking to make our kids successful. You would get a different vision. You're trying to hammer a national picture based on only one example, and it's not working for you. And plus, neither one of them had ever worked with a state system. Now, granted, the Chicago system is bigger than most state systems. However, they didn't understand how the state part of that. And I spent all the time that they were in office virtually, working with them, trying to get them to come and see. I don't think Kansans understand what a jewel this system is. I mean, I don't care where you come from. I mean, we've got kids from Hoxie and kids from Liberal that have been on Fulbright scholarships, who go all over the world, who go to Harvard regularly, who produce students who go everywhere in the world. And we don't, well, I always like to say, I mean, in my neck of the woods, there's been so much publicity about Eric Stone Street and Jason Kadakis, all those guys who came out of the Shawnee Mission School's drama department. I mean, we have a jewel of a system. I am very proud of the time I spent moving it forward. I think that work is continuing, and there are good leaders that are out there working on it now. But I think it's something you can't let slide.
Well, thank you for your work. Thank you for your contributions over a career, the other things you're doing. And thank you for taking a little time today to share this. And in conclusion, I want to, as always, thank our viewers for looking at this. Remember, the transcript is available, and there are many other interviews available for your consideration. So thank you very much.